A frozen puppy cried at a Navy SEAL's door at 3 a.m. What its collar said exposed a dark secret. Snow had been falling on the ridge above Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, since before midnight. The dry, windless kind that came down straight and piled on the pine branches and made the whole mountain go quiet in the specific way it only went quiet after 2 in the morning, and Nate Calhoun was awake. As he was almost always awake at this hour, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee he'd stopped tasting an hour ago, and Hex at his feet and the sound of nothing particular pressing in from outside. He heard it at 3:11, something at the front door. Not a knock, something smaller and more uncertain than a knock. A scratching, and then a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a cry but lived in the register between them. Hex lifted his head. Nate was already moving. On the front step, soaking wet and shaking with the full-body tremor of a small animal that has been cold for a long time, was a yellow Labrador puppy, 12 weeks old, maybe less, with a collar around her neck that was far too large for her, an adult collar cinched to its tightest notch and still loose, and on the collar's leather band, written in permanent marker in the careful, deliberate hand of someone who understood they might not get another chance, 142 Birchwood Lane, an address. Number, name, no phone number, just an address, written by someone who needed to be found and had used the only messenger available. What Nate Calhoun found when he drove up that ridge road in the dark would uncover a cruelty that had been building for 18 months behind the door of a woman who had spent 3 days on a kitchen floor, waiting to see if anyone would come. This is what this channel does. If you're new here, subscribe and stay with this one to the end. Nate had done 12 years with Naval Special Warfare and had been out for 18 months, and was 41 years old and was, in the specific way that men who have operated in extreme conditions sometimes are, more comfortable in the dark than in the light. He had grown up in Sandpoint, 40 miles north of Coeur d'Alene, the son of a woman who taught high school English, and a father who was a county search and rescue volunteer, and who had believed, without making it into a philosophy, that the correct response to finding out someone needed help was to go. Nate had inherited this without examining it. He had enlisted at 22, gone through Bud/S at 24, and had spent the next 12 years doing things in places he would not describe at dinner that had given him a very clear picture of what human beings were capable of, the full range of it, the courage and the cruelty and everything in between, and had come home 18 months ago carrying that picture in a way he had not yet found a frame for. The house on the ridge above Coeur d'Alene had been his father's. His father had died 4 years ago, and the house had sat empty for 2 years while Nate was still active duty. And then Nate had come back to it because it was the place that had the longest running definition of home, and home was what he needed even if he wasn't sure he deserved it yet. He kept the fire going most nights. He had Hex. Hex was a 7-year-old Rottweiler Shepherd mix, black and tan, with a broad head and a chest like a barrel, and the specific quality of stillness that large, well-handled dogs sometimes developed, a settled weight to his presence that Nate had needed without knowing he'd needed it until Hex was already there. He had found Hex at a Kootenai County shelter 3 years ago, a 2-page intake form and $120, and Hex had ridden home in the passenger seat as though this had always been the plan. He sat on Nate's feet at 3 a.m. when the quiet got loud, which was most nights, and the weight of him was the kind of anchor that didn't require explanation. Nate brought the puppy inside and wrapped her in a kitchen towel and held her against his chest until the shaking slowed. She was a yellow lab, female, barely old enough to have been separated from her mother, with the soft, unformed face of a dog that had not yet developed the capacity for anything except trust. Hex came to the kitchen doorway and stood there, not approaching, reading the way careful large dogs read small animals, and then walked to Nate's side and lowered his head to the puppy's level and breathed on her once, a long, warm exhale that the puppy turned into and pressed against. And that was enough for both of them. Nate looked at the collar again. The handwriting was deliberate. Each letter formed with care, not the handwriting of someone in a hurry, the handwriting of someone who had taken the time to write clearly, because being read correctly mattered more than being fast. 142 Birchwood Lane. He knew the road. It turned off the main ridge road 3/4 of a mile from his driveway, an older road that went back into the trees toward properties that had been there since the 50s. He put the puppy inside his jacket, against his chest, so her face was at his collar and her paws were tucked in. He told Hex to come. He got in the truck. Have you ever been awake at 3 in the morning when you had no reason to be? And had the thought, even briefly, that being awake might be the point? Tell me in the comments. I think more people have had that thought than say so. 142 Birchwood Lane was a small house set back from the road in the pines. A craftsman bungalow with a covered porch and a woodpile stacked on one side, and a light on in the kitchen that was the specific kind of light a kitchen had when someone had left it on and not come back to turn it off. Nate knocked. Nothing. Knocked again, louder. He tried the front door. Locked. He went around the side, through the snow, and the back door was ajar, held slightly open by a crack that was too deliberate to be accidental, cold air coming through it. And from inside, a sound. A voice. Low, tired. The voice of someone who had been saying things into a house that wasn't answering for a long time and had not stopped. He went in. Ida Marsh was on the kitchen floor on her side, between the refrigerator and the center island, with a dog bowl of water pulled close to her and a folded dish towel under her head that she had managed to get there herself. She was 78 years old, and she had been on that floor for 3 days, and she looked at Nate when he came through the door with the expression of a woman who had sent a message and was not surprised that it had arrived, only relieved, in the controlled, dignified way of a woman who had decided a long time ago that relief was permissible but falling apart was not. She said, "I know. I have her." He opened his jacket and showed her the puppy, who was awake now and looking at the kitchen with the bright operational curiosity of a young animal evaluating new territory. Ida looked at her, and something in her face went through 3 things in quick succession: relief, and then something warmer than relief, and then the composed steadiness of a woman who had held herself together for 72 hours and was not going to stop now simply because someone had arrived. Ida Marsh had been a reference librarian at the Coeur d'Alene Public Library for 31 years and had retired at 65 with the conviction that every problem had a solution if you knew where to look, and the patience to look carefully. She was the kind of woman who knew how to find things, who had spent 3 decades being the person other people came to when they needed to find something and didn't know where to start. She had applied this conviction to her 3 days on the kitchen floor with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to every problem in her career. She had assessed her situation. She had identified her resources. She had a dog bowl she could reach, and a slow drip from the kitchen faucet she had opened before she fell, and a dish towel, and biscuit. She had managed to call Gerald on the 2nd day, when her phone slid briefly within reach before going under the refrigerator. When Gerald said he'd come in the morning and did not come, she had finished her assessment. She had put her address on Biscuit's collar the day the puppy arrived because she had always meant to get a proper tag made and had not gotten around to it, which was the kind of domestic undone task that accumulated in a house where one person managed everything. She had not foreseen that the unfinished task would become the most important thing she'd ever done. On the 2nd night, when it became clear that Gerald was not coming, she had pulled herself to the back door, opened it, taken the collar off Biscuit's neck and pressed the address side outward to make sure it was visible, and put it back. Then she had opened the door enough for the puppy to go through it, which Biscuit had not wanted to do because Biscuit was 12 weeks old and did not understand doors or cold or addresses written in permanent marker, only that the person she belonged to was on the floor and she should stay. Ida had spent 20 minutes encouraging the puppy out the door. It was the hardest thing she had done in 3 days and the most deliberate. Hex came through the back door and walked to Ida and lay down against her back, his full body length against hers, and the shivering she had been doing, the fine, constant tremor of a body that had been too cold for too long, began slowly to ease. Nate called 911. He told them what he had. He gave the address. He kept his voice level and specific the way he kept his voice in situations where someone's survival was connected to the precision of his communication. While he waited for the paramedics, he kept Ida talking, not to assess her cognition, though he was doing that too, but because talking meant she was present, and present meant she was his to keep present until the professionals arrived. He asked about the house. He asked how long she'd lived here. She said 38 years. She said her husband Douglas had built the porch addition in 1991. She said this with the particular pride of a woman recounting a fact that was also a love story. Nate looked at the living room, visible through the kitchen doorway, a fireplace with photographs on the mantel, a framed service photograph, the kind taken in the formal style of the era, a young man in navy working dress with an underwater demolition insignia on his chest. UDT. Pre-SEAL, the waterborne special operations community that had become what Nate spent 12 years being a part of. He had seen that insignia in history documents and in unit archives, and on the wrists of old men at veteran events who nodded when they saw Nate's own insignia and didn't need to say anything else. He asked if that was Douglas. Ida said yes. She said Douglas had been UDT in Vietnam. She said he had never talked about it and that she had never asked him to, and that the photograph and the framed citation beside it were the only things in the house she had never moved in 38 years from where Douglas had placed them. Nate looked at the citation. He did not read it aloud. He read it to himself, standing in a kitchen doorway at 3:30 in the morning with a puppy asleep inside his jacket. And he understood, in the way that certain understandings arrived, not as information, but as obligation, what kind of house he was in and what kind of debt he had just walked into. He had been in dozens of houses over 12 years. He had never once stood in one that felt like an inheritance. The paramedics arrived at 3:52. Two of them, a man and a woman, professional and efficient, working around Hex without asking him to move because they could see immediately that the large dog lying against the elderly woman's back was not a complication, but a contribution. They assessed Ida. Hypothermia, moderate. Dehydration significant. The hip, which had been Ida's primary fear, was bruised but not fractured, which the lead paramedic told Ida with the specific emphasis of good news that had earned the right to be delivered slowly. They got her onto a stretcher and she was going to be fine, and she knew she was going to be fine, and she looked at Nate from the stretcher with the expression of a woman who had things to say and was calculating the right order to say them. She said, "There's a phone under the refrigerator." He retrieved it. The screen was cracked. The battery was at 4%. He found the call log. Day 2 of the 3 days. A call to a number labeled GARLD, 31 seconds long, outgoing. And after it, nothing incoming from that number. Not that afternoon. Not the next morning. Not in any of the 53 hours between when Ida had called and when Nate's front door had been scratched by a 12-week-old Labrador with an address written on her collar. He plugged the phone into Ida's kitchen charger. He let it charge. He read the texts. Gerald Finch had been Ida's nephew by marriage, Douglas's sister's son, and had inserted himself into Ida's life with the specific patience of a person who understood that the thing they were waiting for would come eventually, and that the work of waiting was to make themselves indispensable in the meantime. He had handled Ida's taxes. He had driven her to appointments. He had suggested gently over the course of a year that having someone with financial power of attorney was simply practical for a woman living alone, and Ida, who was practical, had agreed. The power of attorney had been in place for 14 months. The text showed what 14 months looked like from the inside, a pattern of small management, suggestions that became decisions, questions that were really instructions, the gradual narrowing of the window through which Ida saw her own life. Gerald texting at 9 p.m. the night before to ask if Ida needed anything, not offering to come, not calling. Asking a question that could be answered in one word and that gave him the information he wanted, without requiring him to act on it. He had known she was on the floor. He had known for 2 days. If you were in Nate's position right now, holding that phone, reading those texts, what would you have done first? Be honest with yourself. Type yes or no below. I read every one. Nate called Ida's daughter in Portland. He called the Kootenai County Sheriff's non-emergency line and asked for the deputy who handled financial elder abuse cases. Because there was a deputy who handled financial elder abuse cases in every county in Idaho now, which was a sentence Nate found simultaneously reassuring and devastating. He made both calls before 5 a.m. He sat at Ida's kitchen table after and drank the rest of the coffee that had been in a thermos he'd brought from his house, which was cold by now. And Hex lay on the kitchen floor, and the puppy slept on Hex's back in the specific way puppies slept, which was entirely and without reservation. Gerald Finch arrived at 8:15 in the morning. He came up the front walk with the practiced ease of a man who had been coming to this house for 2 years and had a key and the specific competence of someone who believed he was still the only person who knew. What had happened? Nate opened the door before Gerald reached it. Gerald stopped. He looked at Nate. He looked at Hex, who was standing in the hallway behind Nate, with his head level and his eyes on Gerald. And the growl that came from Hex was low and unbroken, in the register of a dog that had been lying against an old woman on a cold kitchen floor for an hour, and had formed a complete and settled opinion about the man now standing at her door. Gerald had the expression of a man encountering a variable he hadn't accounted for. He looked at the dog. He looked at Nate. He looked for the version of this situation that still worked in his favor, and could not find it. Gerald said he'd come as soon as he heard. Ida said it without raising her voice, without turning to face the door, in the measured tone of a woman stating a fact that required no elaboration and no performance. You told me you'd come in the morning. The hallway was absolutely still. Hex's growl had not changed in register. Gerald was looking at Nate, who was looking at Gerald with a particular quality of attention he had developed over 12 years in rooms where patience was the most powerful thing he could deploy. Complete, unhurried, without any of the tells that people searched for when they were trying to calculate what a situation would cost them. Gerald could not find what he was looking for in Nate's face. There was nothing there to find. The Kootenai County deputy who handled financial elder abuse cases arrived 14 minutes later. Her name was Detective Sergeant Alicia Strand, and she had been doing this work for 6 years and had been called at 4:30 that morning by a retired Navy SEAL who had described what he'd found with the precise, ordered, emotionally neutral language of someone who wanted the information to be usable, which she had appreciated. She was thorough and unhurried, and she spoke to Gerald in the specific cadence of a law enforcement officer who has already decided what she thinks and is conducting the interview to confirm it. She had the phone in an evidence bag by 8:40. The 31-second call on day 2 of the 3 days was in the log with a timestamp. The 9 p.m. text asking if Ida needed anything was in the log with a timestamp. The absence of any response or follow-up call was in the log with a timestamp. Timestamps Detective Strand had found in 6 years of this work were the most reliable witnesses. Gerald Finch retained an attorney by noon. The withdrawals from Ida's accounts over 14 months, $63,000 characterized in Gerald's own records as family support expenditures, were the subject of a civil recovery action filed by Ida's daughter's attorney the following week, and of a criminal referral to the Idaho Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division the week after that. Gerald's attorney issued a statement saying his client disputed the characterization of the transactions. Nobody quoted from it twice. Pastor Roy Emmons from Ida's Presbyterian Church arrived that evening, having been called by 3 separate members of the congregation who had heard from the deputy's sister-in-law, which was how information moved through a community of a certain size and density. He sat with Ida for an hour, and they talked in the way that people who had known each other for 30 years talked about hard things, directly, without drama, in the shared language that made certain silences carry as much as certain sentences. He had brought a casserole from his wife and a small pot of tulip bulbs from someone named Margaret, who had heard what happened and wanted to send something living. Ida thanked him for both and said Margaret always did know the right thing. Pastor Emmons said Margaret had been practicing for 50 years, which made Ida laugh, and that was the right note to end on. 2 weeks later, when Ida was fully recovered and back in her own house with a medical alert device on her wrist and Biscuit's collar tag reading Ida's Biscuit, 142 Birchwood Lane in clean stamped letters, Nate drove up the Ridge Road to check on the door latch that the deputy had said needed reinforcing. He fixed the latch in 40 minutes. He had coffee at the kitchen table. Biscuit climbed onto his boot and went to sleep there, which Nate permitted because it seemed ungracious to move her. Ida showed him the framed citation beside Douglas's photograph, which she had taken down from the mantel for the first time in 38 years so Nate could read it properly. Douglas Marsh had received a Navy Commendation Medal for his service in SEAL Team 2's predecessor unit during operations in the Mekong Delta in 1968. The citation described actions that Nate recognized in the language of his own profession. The kind of thing men did in dark water in difficult conditions, without expecting to be recognized for it, and which the citation recognized belatedly and incompletely as such citations always did. Nate read it twice. He put it back in Ida's hands. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had been awake at 3 in the morning for 18 months, and for the first time he understood what it had been for. Not all of it. He wasn't ready to say all of it. But this piece, the specific piece where a man who had spent 12 years doing what Douglas Marsh had done in a different era was awake at the right hour to hear a 12-week-old Labrador crying on a front step in the snow. This piece had a shape to it that he could hold. He was going to hold it. This story is for every person who has been awake at 3 in the morning for a reason they couldn't name and found, eventually, that the reason was waiting on a doorstep. And for every woman who has found the only messenger available and trusted it. Is there a person in your life who sent a message the only way they could and hoped someone would be awake to receive it? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away, and sometimes about being awake when the knock comes. Subscribe if that means something to you. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in the story will stay with you? I'll see you in the comments.